G'day, Andrew Gregson from the New South Wales Irrigators Council. Just over 12 months ago now, the guide to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan was released and was met with furore right across Australia, and for very good reason, as we would have seen thousands of jobs lost, we would have seen the price of fresh food go up, businesses and communities right across inland Australia devastated, and a whole range of impacts visited on those who could least afford it. 12 months has progressed now, and the new draft of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan has not yet been presented, but there's plenty of discussion in the media and a few leaks as to what's going on. Irrigators Council has been reasonably quiet on the basis that we wanted to wait until we saw what the draft Basin Plan said before we commented. We seem to be one of the few that's left that's having done that. The current thinking of just about everybody now appears to be out in the public domain, so we thought it was probably time that we provided some commentary on where we currently sit vis-a-vis the debate over the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. So this presentation's in a very quick 4 parts. First of all, we'll be talking about our current thinking on Mr Knowles's current thinking. We'll be talking about our current thinking on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's current thinking, our current thinking on the impacts of everybody's current thinking, and our current thinking on what people should currently be thinking about. So with some luck, this will be a reasonably current presentation. Let's start by talking about what Mr Knowles's current thinking is, and more to the point, what we think about it. Mr Knowles, of course, is the chairman of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, who took over just under 12 months ago now, when Mike Taylor, the chairman of the authority, when the guide was released, resigned from that position. Mr Knowles has made it fairly clear in a recent video that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority published that his current thinking is primarily about how to achieve the targets within the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. He said in that video that things have changed, things continue to change, and we need to have a plan that's flexible. That's a big tick from us. That's something that's to be applauded. The climate in the course of the last 12 to 18 months has certainly shown that flexibility is necessary, where over the course of the last decade we've suffered through a crippling drought. Of course, the impacts of the rains returning again have been seen not only for irrigation farmers and their communities, but also for the environment. The birds out there are breeding like you would not believe, so that flexibility is necessary and a big tick. Mr Knowles has asked that there be a hardwired review at 2015 to give some sort of check and balance in the process where things can be considered as to whether they're working. Again, a big tick. That's exactly what we should be expecting. One of the things that Mr Knowles has said that does concern us a little is that the sustainable diversion limits will commence in 2019. That's not, in our opinion, entirely correct. The process of the Basin Plan commenced at the time the first megalitre of water was bought, and we know that the Commonwealth have been a major participant in the water market, and that water has now been taken permanently away from productive use, and that's had massive impacts in a whole lot of towns right across the Murray-Darling Basin. Perhaps the best example is the town of Moree on the Gwydir River in northern New South Wales, where the Commonwealth now own in excess of 20% of the entitlements. That water, whilst being used for environmental use, won't be used for productive agriculture. The dollars from that agriculture won't be seen in the local or indeed the broader Australian economy. So these impacts are forever, and they have started already. Mr Knowles has also made a great deal of the term localism, and in his recent video published by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, he explained what that meant. He said it means that over the course of the implementation period between now and 2019, people with an intimate knowledge of river systems will be given the opportunity to provide some input, and if that input is valuable and if it means we can achieve outcomes with a lower volume of water, then that input will be listened to. Again, a big tick, exactly what we've been asking for and what should be happening. He's also mentioned that one of the things he wants to do is engage, or have the Commonwealth and the states engage in a rules review to potentially provide some further water for environmental use. Now, whilst that's an approach to be commended, we have some serious reservations about it. A change in a rule does not create any new water. A change in a rule does not provide further water for environmental use without taking it from somewhere else. So we want to know exactly what this proposed rules review is all about and where that water will be coming from. Mr Knowles finally notes that whilst his current thinking is 2,800, he's having the authority model up and down 400 gigalitres from that, so between 2,400 and 3,200. What that says to us is that, frankly, it's still all about the numbers. When it comes down to it, it's about numbers, somewhere between 2,400 and 3,200 as far as the MDBA are concerned, and not about outcomes. And what we've argued from the very start is that this should be about achieving some very clear outcomes. Those outcomes should be set down, discussed, debated and agreed by all before we simply head off to take water out of productive use. The talk to date is effectively about how to get to numbers, not why we need to get to these numbers. What we need for regional and rural communities and the Australian economy as a whole, and for those whose jobs stand to be lost and farms to close, what they need is an explanation of why this is necessary. Because to date, there's been a comprehensive failure on behalf of those involved to explain exactly why this is absolutely necessary and why it must happen. The other thing that we find to be a problem is that the social and economic impact statements remain very much a secondary consideration. It's about environmental goals or targets, or potentially about outcomes if they were explained to us, but the social and economic ramifications, in our opinion, remain secondary, and that's not good enough. A little bit more on that in a moment. Let's move on to what the Murray-Darling Basin Authority's current thinking is, and what we think about it, because frankly, what Mr Knowles is saying and what some of the other members of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority are saying are sometimes two different things, and that leads us to a great deal of concern. In September this year, Professor Barry Hart, who's one of the Authority members, provided a presentation to the River Symposium in Brisbane. Now, you'll have noticed that Mr Knowles uses the phrase me, my, mine and I an awful lot, and that's fine with us. Mr Knowles has taken very much a guiding principle in terms of the Basin Plan and to a positive end. But he leads 6 other Authority members and a great deal of staff, and we're not convinced that they're all on the same page. This is from the presentation that Professor Hart gave to that River Symposium in Brisbane. It was titled Striking the Right Balance. Now, this presentation is a series of slides that is available online, and that's where we've accessed it from. You'll notice that one of the early slides in the presentation was defining the environment, and you'll see there at the top it says this is largely done in the Water Act. In other words, there's not been any objective consideration of what the environment is. What is it that we're trying to protect? Which assets? How are we going about protecting them? And what are, here's the key word, the outcomes that we're seeking, as opposed to simply subjectively determining here's the environment, there is a number, that's what it's going to be, and now we've got to find the water to deal with it. So we're not entirely convinced that Mr Knowles has got everybody on exactly the same page that he's thinking about, because this is exactly what caused the problem with the guide. The absolute slavery to the Commonwealth Water Act, which we say is the problem in the first instance. Now, I said I'd get back to the concerns about social and economic implications being secondary. This is another slide from that same presentation to the River Symposium. You'll notice that the 5 boxes over towards the left there are all about ecological functions and hydrologic indicators and so on and so forth, and how that gets put into this blue box called environmental water requirements. From there it gets fed into this process, and you'll see a nice little circular system between system constraints and socio-economic analysis. What that says to us is that social and economic impacts remain secondary to the environment. That is not what we were promised in the National Water Initiative, which said there would be trade-off between social, economic and environmental requirements. It's not what's being delivered by the Water Act, and it's why it must change. And I think that's probably why Mr Knowles is finding some divergence within his own Authority members. One of the other slides that Professor Hart used in that presentation, I think, summed it up quite nicely. When he was talking about social and economic impacts, he said, at a long-term basin scale, we will see a small economic effect. Well, I've got no doubt that he's got economists that are telling him that the Australian economy over the next 20 years will grow. But when the Murray-Darling Basin Authority told people in the guide that the economic and social implications would be small, the ramifications and the fallout was significant. This is a plea directly to them. Please don't think that you can tell us this will have small economic and social impacts. We know differently. Logic tells us differently, and all you've got to do is ask about property prices or commercial values or social fabric in any of these towns across the basin right now, and you'll get an understanding of the implications of what you're doing. So please don't tell us it won't have a big impact, because we all logically know it will. This is another slide from that same presentation, and I think it probably tells you what I'm trying to get to in the underlying assumptions that have been made about environment and what it requires. What they're seeking is this: 67% for the environment and 33% for, they call it consumption, we call it productive water use. This whole process goes back to a sustainable rivers audit that the CSIRO undertook several years ago that said, in a fairly blanket statement, it's healthy for a river system to have 1/3 of its volume extracted as long as it keeps 2/3. We're not able to find any scientific evidence for that being the basis for environmental or ecological health. It's a simple assumption, and Australia should demand better when you're talking about the livelihoods of tens of thousands of people right across the Murray-Darling Basin. A simple 2/3, 1/3 underlying basis for this whole thing, it's not good enough. Let's move on to our current thinking on the impacts of everybody else's current thinking, because frankly what we said previously was that the thinking then was going to cause thousands of jobs to be lost right across New South Wales and indeed across the Murray-Darling Basin. It was going to close a large number of family farms right across the Murray-Darling Basin. We've said that the communities and businesses out there will be some of the hardest that are hit because they don't get to sell water, they still have to try to exist in that town, and all of a sudden the economic activity is no longer there. And that also leads on obviously to major social problems. And we said finally that the cost of fresh food right across Australia would naturally increase. If you decrease supply, simple laws of supply and demand say that the price goes up. That was our previous thinking. So what's changed? That's the key question to ask after the last 12 months. What's changed? Well, what we've seen is a change from 3,000 gigalitres to 2,800 gigalitres. That's a reduction of 6%. Not an enormous amount. What it's looking at is 179 gigalitres less in the northern basin and only 36 gigalitres less in the southern basin. So if the numbers are largely the same, one would expect that the impacts would be largely the same, and we've already told you what we think the impacts are going to be. Those numbers don't add up because there's 13 more to come out of the Wimmera-Avoca system and a further 3 out of the Lachlan. But in essence, the changes that are proposed in terms of these numbers are not a great deal. Those communities that rely on irrigation, those businesses, those family farms, that social fabric that relies on water as its lifeblood for agricultural production still sits in pretty much the same position it did pursuant to the guide. And I think we probably made it pretty clear what we thought about the guide. So finally, here's our thinking on what people should be thinking about in terms of current thinking. There it is. This is a slide that I've been pushing for the last 2 years. It's all about the Water Act. The Water Act was written with a political background. Its objects, and those objects still remain there, are threefold: to balance social, economic and environmental considerations. The output of the Water Act is the Basin Plan. The Basin Plan is first and foremost about the environment. Social and economic considerations come a distant second. We've said all along that's not good enough. We've identified the root cause of the problem, and frankly we still believe that the Water Act must change in order for us to get to a decent outcome. The Murray-Darling Basin Authority are doing a pretty reasonable job. There's a lot of people in there that have done an awful lot and produced an awful lot of valuable work during the course of the last 12 months, and indeed prior to that. And Craig Knowles should be given credit where it's due. He has tried to drag them towards a path that is more acceptable. But Craig is tied by exactly the same legislation that Mike Taylor was. He's heading down the path that the Parliament set out for him. The Senate Constitutional and Legal Affairs Committee said that that legislation needs to be reviewed, and we say the time to do that is now. There is no need to implement a basin plan that will cause such massive social and economic dislocation without having described the environmental benefits that are sought, and it's time for the Parliament to take control of this whole matter once again. The Water Act set us out on a bad path, and it's time for us to revisit that. Once again, my name's Andrew Gregson. I'm the CEO of New South Wales Irrigators Council. You can find out more about our organisation at this address, nswic.org.au. Thanks very much for watching, and please feel free to be in touch with any questions.